Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into one of the least exciting prehistoric mysteries you've never heard of. A story with no big twist, no villain, and barely a plot. You're about to meet a fish so vague, so inconvenient, and so poorly understood that it's famous for being a problem. Imagine drifting down through cold, ancient seas, past reefs of crinoids and sluggish ichthyosaurs, until you find not a sleek predator, not some toothy nightmare, but a hulking, slow-moving fish the size of a city bus that probably just wanted to be left alone. And honestly, it almost was. You're not here for action. You're here for gentle confusion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all tune in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're drifting again, somewhere off the coast of what will one day be England. The year is around 165 million BCE, though the fish in front of you doesn't seem to know or care. It doesn't dart or lunge. It doesn't flash. It just sort of is. It glides along in slow, indifferent loops, gaping mouth yawning open to filter plankton that probably tastes like sea-flavored dust. This is Leedsichthys problematicus, your main character for the night. A fish so devoid of drama that it's honestly perfect for bedtime. No jump scares. No battles. Just fossil fragments, mild scientific confusion, and the occasional taxonomic headache. You watch it drift. It's massive, easily the length of a school bus, maybe longer. The water parts lazily around its body. This isn't the fastest swimmer in the sea, or the smartest, or the best armored, but it might just be the biggest bony fish to have ever lived. And that's kind of its whole thing. No teeth to marvel at, no claws. Just a skeleton that refuses to be found in one piece and a name that literally admits it's a pain. Here's the thing, most prehistoric celebrities show up in dramatic fossil form. T-Rex? Whole skeletons, museum roars, branded lunchboxes. But Leedsichthys? This poor fish has never gotten its act together. The bones we do have are scattered like a dropped jigsaw puzzle, most of them warped, broken, or just plain weird. You could walk past one in a museum and think it was a piece of ceiling plaster. In fact, you probably have. But let's rewind. You need to understand how this whole boring mess started. You find yourself standing ankle-deep in a muddy quarry in 19th century England. The weather is gray. The mood is grayer. A few local fossil hunters are scraping away at limestone layers that have coughed up everything from ammonites to the occasional marine reptile. Then someone finds it, a chunk of bone. Thick, oddly shaped. Maybe a rib? Maybe not. No one celebrates. No one yells eureka. It's just a thing. One guy squints at it and mumbles something about fish. The fossil gets passed along. Eventually it lands in the hands of Alfred Nicholson Leeds, a man with the sort of passion for marine fossils that usually involves long days in the rain and arguments with museum curators. Leeds was thorough. He collected thousands of fossils from the Oxford Clay Formation, many of them marine reptiles. But one discovery kept nagging him, a giant fish represented by frustratingly incomplete parts. He didn't name it himself. That honor, or curse, went to Arthur Smith Woodward, a paleontologist at the British Museum, who finally gave this mystery fish a name in 1889, Leedsichthys problematicus. Yes, he really slapped problematic into the name. Even in Latin, that's just passive-aggressive. Woodward wasn't trying to be mean. The fossil was genuinely a nightmare to classify. It didn't quite fit with known fish groups, and the material was fragmentary at best. But he did what scientists do when something won't behave. He labeled it and moved on. You might be wondering, why was it such a mess? Well, picture this. A fish dies in the open ocean. Its giant body sinks, slowly, through the water column. It hits the seabed and becomes a buffet. Scavengers swarm. Currents scatter. Soft tissues rot. The skeleton collapses into itself. Over time, the bones separate, crack, and distort under sediment pressure. Now fast forward 165 million years, then yank that mess out of rock with a pickaxe. That's what paleontologists are working with. And not all fish fossilize equally. Cartilage and delicate bone tend to vanish. What's left behind are thicker structures, gill arches, chunks of skull, weird fin bits that don't give a full picture. It's like trying to rebuild a skyscraper using only some plumbing and a few floor tiles. Still, there was enough there to suspect something big was going on. That early specimen? It hinted at ridiculous size. Even conservative estimates placed Leedsichthys at over 10 meters. Some later guesses ballooned it up to 16, 20, even 27 meters. That's right. In theory, it could have rivaled a blue whale. And unlike most ocean giants, it wasn't made of squishy cartilage like a shark. This thing had bones, which made it, by definition, the largest bony fish known. But that raised eyebrows. How do you even estimate size from scattered bones? You don't have a spine. You don't have a tail. Sometimes you don't even know what bone you're looking at. Historians still argue whether the largest specimens even belong to Leedsichthys or some other species entirely. Then there's the not-so-little problem of the bones themselves. Leedsichthys fossils are fragile, brittle, and easily misidentified. For decades, collectors and curators labeled them as reptile bones or dismissed them as unidentifiable fragments. Some pieces sat in museum drawers for over a century before someone realized, oh wait, this might be fish. And it gets better. Some early reconstructions of Leedsichthys had it swimming around with its mouth closed, shaped like a bloated sardine. Others made it look like a giant tuna. There were even some who thought it might have been a predator, not a filter feeder. It took a while to figure out it probably ate tiny plankton, and even then, not everyone agreed. That brings us to your first quirky tidbit. One proposed reconstruction had Leedsichthys swimming upright like a submarine periscope. A big vertical fish. Needless to say, that one didn't make it into many textbooks. But here's the weird piece of it all. Despite all the confusion, all the scientific missteps, and the complete lack of a full skeleton, Leedsichthys still holds its awkward crown. Biggest bony fish. Problematic to the end. And you? You're just watching it drift. Still enormous. Still passive. Its body barely flexes with each movement. Just enough to keep water flowing through its gills, filtering out tiny meals. It doesn't need to hunt. It doesn't need to flee. It's too big to mess with, too slow to chase. Just a living funnel, hoovering up microscopic life forms one lazy gulp at a time. There's something weirdly calming about that, right? No panic. No pressure. Just endless, quiet consumption. And as you float alongside it, you realize something else. Leedsichthys doesn't care what people call it. Doesn't care how confused scientists are. It just existed. Huge, boring, and undeniable. Tomorrow's headlines will belong to raptors and saber-tooths. But tonight? Tonight's for the problematic fish. You're still drifting, barely kicking your feet as the water around you cools a little more. The seabed below looks like someone dumped an entire museum collection into a blender. Bones poke out at odd angles. Nothing connected, nothing orderly. That's your first clue. You're stepping into fossil territory. But not the tidy kind. The kind that ruins people's careers, or at least gives them a persistent headache and a growing collection of unresolved files. Now the year's around the late 1800s, and you're standing in a damp trench outside Peterborough, England. The ground is sticky clay. You've got Victorian trousers soaked up to the knees, and someone nearby just muttered that they might have struck a vertebra, or maybe not. The energy here? Underwhelming. This isn't some dramatic dig site packed with treasure-hunting eccentrics shouting about missing links. This is slow, methodical work. Gentle chiseling. Careful brushing. The fossils they're pulling up belong to a time when England was underwater, millions of years before it became anything resembling a reigning empire. You're in the Oxford Clay Formation, and it's basically a Jurassic filing cabinet. One that's been repeatedly kicked down the stairs. You're watching the early discovery of Leedsichthys unfold, and to be honest, it's not the kind of scene that ends up in documentaries. There's no intact skull. No movie-worthy reveal. Just a few dense, weirdly shaped bones spread over a muddy patch the size of a tennis court. There's a hint of something big, but nothing to latch onto. A rib here. A fin fragment there. Some broken gill arches that look more like warped boomerangs than anything useful. And this is where the mess begins. A fossil like this doesn't scream, "new species." It mumbles, shrugs, and hands you a box of puzzles with half the pieces missing. But Alfred Leeds, our Victorian fossil collector from Section 1, doesn't scare off easily. He's already made a name for himself dragging marine reptile bones out of this area, and now he's interested in something even stranger. Something fishy, but not in the usual sense. You lean over his shoulder as he squints at a thick, curved piece of bone. He's thinking not reptile, but also not anything we've seen before. Eventually, he sends it to the British Museum, because when in doubt, mail your problems to someone else. Enter Arthur Smith Woodward. Now, Woodward isn't just anyone. This guy is the fish guy at the British Museum of Natural History. He's up to his eyeballs in fossil fish, and he's not easily impressed. But even he takes one look at this collection of bones and sighs. It doesn't fit. It's not clearly a known group. The morphology's weird. And it's huge. So, he does what anyone might do when something annoys them just enough to be important but not enough to enjoy. He names it Leedsichthys problematicus. Leeds fish that's a problem. Yes, seriously. You kind of admire the honesty, don't you? From here, the fossils make their way into collections. Some are mounted. Some are boxed. Most just confuse everyone. The problem isn't just classification, it's that no one really knows what they're looking at. These bones are so large and so strangely shaped that, at first, some paleontologists think they might belong to a marine reptile. Others wonder if they're part of an enormous filter-feeding shark. The debate spins on, fueled by guesswork and wishful diagrams. Historians still argue whether Woodward got the classification anywhere close to right. Some believe he latched onto fish because it was the best bad option. Others think he saw something no one else did. Either way, the name stuck. And so did the headache. But there's another problem, fossil context. Let's say you find a single rib. Just one. How do you know how long the animal was? How do you know what shape it was? Now imagine that rib is a bit warped, maybe crushed during fossilization, or broken and then eroded. And even if you do get lucky and find more than one bone, they often aren't connected. They're not part of a full skeleton. You're stuck playing prehistoric Frankenstein. That's exactly what happened with Leedsichthys. In the Peterborough quarries, fossil hunters started unearthing more pieces, but they never fit together. A gill arch here, a fin base there, maybe a chunk of the skull, but no spine, no tail, and certainly no complete jaw. It's like trying to reconstruct a city from a broken water pipe, a section of roof tile, and one park bench. Still, it didn't stop people from trying. As more fossils were dug up, museums began assembling reconstructions. Picture long display cases with bones laid out in neat rows, none of them obviously related. There's no moment here, just rows of scientific uncertainty, carefully labeled. To fill the gaps, early paleontologists did what they always do, they guessed. This gave rise to some truly bizarre interpretations. At one point, someone proposed that Leedsichthys had a massive sail-like dorsal fin, similar to a Spinosaurus but on a fish. Another thought it might have had paddle-like limbs. These weren't fringe scientists either, just experts trying to make sense of the noise. And while we're here, let's throw in your required quirky tidbit. One 19th century scholar actually suggested that Leedsichthys might not have been a single animal, but a combination of two entirely different species fossilized together. A fish. And something else. Like prehistoric taxidermy gone wrong. Spoiler, that theory did not age well. But there was one clear point of agreement. This thing was huge. Every bone screamed size. Even the smallest fragments pointed to a fish that could eat a modern tuna in one gulp, if it weren't too busy sucking down plankton. So, back to that muddy quarry. You imagine the team standing over yet another chunk of vertebra, or maybe gill arch, brushing away the clay and muttering things like, definitely not ichthyosaur, or, probably fish, but who even knows anymore? These aren't glamorous moments. No one's holding up the fossil and shouting into the distance. Most of the time, they're just taking careful notes and quietly panicking about how to label things. The truth is, Leedsichthys got off to a bad start. From the moment it was named, it became a kind of scientific shrug. Not important enough to center a museum around, but not insignificant enough to ignore. And that's a rough place to be in the fossil world. But it was interesting enough to start drawing attention, especially from German, French, and later American scientists, who all wanted in on the mystery. Fossils started turning up across Europe, each more confusing than the last. Some bones were catalogued under different names. Others were mislabeled as parts of marine reptiles or even large amphibians. A few were probably tossed out. It was the scientific equivalent of trying to organize a garage full of unlabeled IKEA parts and hoping you'd end up with a bicycle. Historians still argue whether the earliest reconstructions distorted public understanding permanently. Once you draw a diagram and publish it, even if it's speculative, people tend to latch onto it. Leedsichthys became a sort of paleontological ink blot test. Everyone saw what they wanted. Giant tuna, prehistoric whalefish, filter feeder, predator, maybe something entirely new. The worst part? Nobody could prove anyone wrong. The fossils didn't provide enough evidence either way. That ambiguity stuck. Leedsichthys entered the literature not as a marvel, but as a mystery, referenced in academic footnotes, occasionally trotted out in museum displays, but always with a big asterisk attached. You imagine the poor curators, standing in front of a display case full of bones labeled Leedsichthys SP, trying to explain to school groups why this fish mattered. You can almost hear one of them saying, "We think this was part of the jaw, but it could also be a gill structure." Possibly. Great confidence booster. And yet, there's something charming about it, isn't there? This wasn't a creature that fought for survival with razor teeth or armor plating. It didn't inspire legends or nightmares. It didn't win any evolutionary races. It just existed, massive, quiet, and vaguely annoying to every scientist who's ever tried to study it. You glance down again at the bones in the clay. You squint at the ridges and the wear patterns. Nothing leaps out at you. No narrative offers itself. But still, somehow this fish has endured. Not because we understand it, but because we don't. And in the world of prehistoric creatures, that kind of mystery is rare. You're standing in a quiet gallery of the British Museum. It's late, so late it's just you, the echo of your own footsteps, and a row of glass cases filled with bones that look like leftovers from a construction site. The label says Leedsichthys problematicus, but it might as well say don't ask. One bone's shaped like a warped hockey stick. Another resembles a flattened boomerang. And the only thing they have in common is that none of them look especially fishy. You tilt your head and wonder aloud, why problematicus? Let's break it down. The genus name, Leedsichthys, is a nod to Alfred Nicholson Leeds, the fossil collector we met earlier who kicked off this whole sleepy saga. Ichthys is Greek for fish. Pretty standard stuff. But it's that species name, Problematicus, that deserves a standing ovation. Arthur Smith Woodward, the paleontologist who named it, wasn't being cute. He was being honest. Brutally, academically honest. In 1889, when he finally slapped a label on this thing, he didn't know what else to call it. The bones didn't match any known fish. They didn't match reptiles either. He couldn't place it in any comfortable taxonomic box, so he did the scholarly equivalent of throwing up his hands. Here, then, is your main character. A fish that confuses everyone so deeply that its official scientific name just throws in the towel. It's weirdly poetic. Most scientific names are proud. They boast. Tyrannosaurus rex, tyrant lizard king. Triceratops, three-horned face. But Leedsichthys problematicus? That's Leeds fish that is a problem. You can practically hear the sigh. Historians still argue whether Woodward meant the name to be temporary, like a post-it note on a fossil drawer, or if he truly thought the fish would always be a problem. Either way, he wasn't wrong. That name has aged like an open jar of mayonnaise, and yet, it's never been changed. And you know what? It fits. You walk past the display case. Each fossil fragment feels like a riddle with its answer lost in a fire. The gill arches are absurdly big, long, delicate structures that suggest a filter feeder. But they're so mangled it's hard to tell if you're looking at one bone or three fused together. Then there's the pectoral fin base, which looks like someone tried to fossilize a lasagna noodle. It's not elegant. It's not clear. It's problematic. Here's the thing with naming. In taxonomy, once a name is published and accepted under the rules of nomenclature, it tends to stick unless something really compelling comes along to replace it. And for Leedsichthys, nothing has. No one's found a full enough skeleton to warrant reclassification. No one's made a strong enough argument to challenge Woodward's original take. So, problematic as it remains, unshakable, unapologetic. You imagine being a new paleontologist today, digging up something that looks vaguely familiar. You haul it back to the lab, clean it, analyze it, and slowly realize, yep, it's that fish again. The one that makes your job harder. The one that refuses to give you clean answers. The one that's practically heckling you from the past. And let's not forget the ripple effect. Once Leedsichthys got its name, it started showing up in scholarly papers. Usually at the end of lists. Usually with phrases like tentatively identified as, or possibly referable to. That's paleontology speak for we don't really know, but we had to write something. It became a placeholder for big, messy fish fossils. An umbrella category for the unclassifiable. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. By the way, Leedsichthys was one of the first truly gigantic bony fish to be described from the fossil record. Before that, most big fish fossils were actually sharks, made of cartilage and rarely preserved in full. This was something new. A colossus with a real skeleton, even if we only had crumbs of it. Now, most paleontologists love patterns. Clean phylogenetic trees. Clear relationships. They want to know where an animal fits, what it evolved from, what it evolved into. But with Leedsichthys? Good luck. It's so poorly preserved and so unusual that pinning it down has turned into a generational chore. You peek behind the curtain and discover the taxonomic back and forth. At first, Woodward places it in its own family, Leedsichthyidae. Because of course he does. You can't lump it in with known groups when it won't behave. Over the years, others have tried aligning it with pachycormids, an extinct group of Mesozoic fish that includes some other filter feeders. That kind of works. Kind of. But then someone points out that Leedsichthys lacks clear diagnostic features of other pachycormids. The skull is all wrong. The gill structures are oversized. The vertebrae, when they're found, don't match expectations. And the jaw? Don't even start. Some reconstructions draw it with a whale-like mouth. Others think it was flatter, almost sturgeon-like. There's not enough data to settle it. That open scholarly debate? It's been going for over a century. Is Leedsichthys even a pachycormid at all? Or is it something else entirely? A lineage unto itself? A side branch of evolution that went nowhere and left no clear descendants? No one agrees. No one's even confident enough to pretend they do. The taxonomic section of any paper on Leedsichthys reads like someone writing a breakup text while still hoping to stay friends. Awkward. Tentative. Full of mixed signals. And yet, the name persists. There's something weirdly comforting about that, too. In a field obsessed with classification, Leedsichthys remains defiantly unsorted. It's the fossil equivalent of, it's complicated. You circle back to that name. Problematicus. You realize how rare that level of scientific vulnerability is. Most species are named for their discoverers, their shapes, their habitats. But this one? It was named for the feeling it gave the person studying it. Imagine naming a new planet, Confusion, or a new bird, Please Help Moose. That's where we are. The name has inspired decades of quiet amusement in the paleontological community. It's become shorthand for messy fossils. If someone says, this specimen is a bit problematicus, you know exactly what they mean. It's a vibe now, a diagnosis. And yet, Leedsichthys soldiers on. Appearing in textbooks with heavy disclaimers. Featured in children's dinosaur books as a bonus fish at the back. Occasionally rendered in CGI documentaries, usually as a giant filter feeder surrounded by question marks and speculation. It never gets the spotlight, but it never fully fades either. You picture it again, drifting through ancient seas. Not caring about its name. Not caring that humans can't figure it out. It's just there, big, slow, unbothered. A floating contradiction. A fossil that refuses to fit. And, strangely, a perfect bedtime companion. Because isn't that the goal tonight? Not to solve anything. Just to float, to drift, to let the ambiguity carry you. Leedsichthys is here for that. Still problematic. Still swimming. You're underwater again, somewhere in the warm shallows of the late Jurassic Sea. Light filters down in broad, wavy stripes, touching the backs of creatures that no longer exist. There's movement, sure, but it's not fast. Nothing here is in a hurry, including the slow, looming shadow that glides past just below you. It's Leedsichthys. Still impossibly huge. Still unimpressed by everything. You stare at its jaw, or what you think is its jaw, and wonder, is this even a fish? Is it a whale in disguise? A bloated shark? What even is this thing? And honestly, you're not the first person to ask, because when it was first found, no one could agree on what Leedsichthys actually was. Let's start with the obvious. It's not a whale. There were no whales in the Jurassic. Whales wouldn't appear for another 100 million years or so. And Leedsichthys doesn't have the telltale signs of a marine reptile either. No flipper bones, no pointy teeth, no dramatic skull crest. Still, that didn't stop early fossil hunters from squinting at its remains and scratching their heads. The bones were too big for a normal fish. Too weird for a reptile. Too incomplete to say much at all. And the gill arches, those long rib-like things, were just confusing enough to throw people off completely. Some thought they were ribs. Others thought they were jaw fragments. A few even thought they were part of a shellfish. Really. Historians still argue whether the earliest Leedsichthys bones were misclassified simply because they broke every mold paleontologists were used to working with. The Victorian system of taxonomy, rigid, ambitious, often wildly wrong, wasn't built to handle animals that didn't play by the rules. The early debates were a mess. One group claimed it was a primitive bony fish. Another thought it was some massive chimera, like a prehistoric version of a ratfish. A third floated the idea that it was a distant relative of sturgeons. The problem? No one had a full skeleton. Everyone was playing fossil charades with blurry clues. Let's pause on that image. A paleontology conference in 1890, a group of men with waxed mustaches arguing about one enormous fish bone, and none of them even agreeing which end of the fish it came from. You admire the commitment. Eventually, most researchers settled on the idea that Leedsichthys was a filter feeder, sort of like a whale shark, but with real bones instead of cartilage. It made sense. The gill arches were enormous and delicate, perfect for filtering tiny organisms from the water. Plus, the mouth, what they'd found of it, seemed built more for scooping than biting. But here's where it gets messy again. Some of the bones had strange wear patterns, not consistent with filter feeding. Some paleontologists started whispering, what if it was a predator? What if it could bite? What if we'd misunderstood its whole lifestyle? The debate got academic, then petty. One side argued it was a passive giant that slurped plankton all day. The other thought it might have been more active, maybe even opportunistic. Maybe it gulped schools of small fish. Maybe it hunted, clumsily. Here's your quirky tidbit for this section. One 20th century paleontologist tried to draw Leedsichthys with lips. Like actual human-like lips. Full-on trout pout. The idea was that soft tissue could have made a better suction mechanism. The drawing didn't survive peer review, but the concept haunted people for a while. Another weird theory? That Leedsichthys may have used its gills not just for filtering, but for sound resonance, creating deep underwater vibrations to confuse prey or communicate across long distances. Kind of like a Jurassic foghorn. There's no evidence for that, but hey, it's bedtime. Let the theories drift. You float beside the animal again. Massive. Peaceful. It doesn't seem like a predator. Not a very good one, anyway. Its mouth opens in slow motion, pulling water and plankton through sieve-like gill rakers. No chasing. No snapping. Just lazy inhalation. And this brings us back to classification. You already know it was dumped in its own family, Leedsichthyidae. But that's not the same as understanding where it fits. What group of fish is it closest to? What did it evolve from? Paleontologists tossed it tentatively into the pachycormids, a family of extinct ray-finned fish that includes some real oddballs. Most pachycormids were fast swimmers, many were predators. Some had streamlined bodies. None were quite like this. So paleontologists took a closer look. Leedsichthys lacked key features of other pachycormids. Its fin structure was different. Its skull, what little we have, didn't line up. And its sheer size threw everything off. Most pachycormids were, well, fish-sized. Leedsichthys was a whale-sized outlier. It's like going through your family photo album and finding a blurry picture of someone 8 feet tall wearing a bathrobe and holding a pigeon. You're not sure who they are, but you hope they're related. Some scholars propose that Leedsichthys wasn't really a pachycormid at all. Maybe it was a cousin. Maybe it was the result of convergent evolution, developing a similar lifestyle to modern filter feeders but coming from an entirely different lineage. Others weren't convinced. We just don't have enough, they said. Until we find a full skeleton, this thing is a taxonomic black hole. And they're right. Every new fossil adds a piece of the puzzle. But every piece is warped, eroded, or incomplete. One gill arch fossil might belong to a juvenile. Another might be from an adult. Maybe they're even from different species. Nobody can be sure. Which means that for over 130 years, this fish has sat at the very edge of scientific understanding. Not quite here, not quite there. Never quite solved. And here's the kicker. Most paleontologists don't even study Leedsichthys anymore. Not seriously. It's too inconvenient. Too few fossils. Too many unanswered questions. Easier to focus on T-Rex, on stegosaur tails, on flashy things with teeth. So Leedsichthys is left behind. A giant mystery, quietly drifting in the background. Occasionally revisited when someone stumbles onto a new bone, but mostly ignored. You feel a little sorry for it. A fish so big it dominated its ecosystem. A fish so old it predates birds, flowers, and the Atlantic Ocean. A fish so frustrating that the people who discovered it gave up halfway through naming it. And still it swims. You're gliding beside it now. Its eyes are small. Its body broad and slow-moving. A living submarine, indifferent to the chaos of classification. It doesn't care if you call it a pachycormid. It doesn't care if it has a family tree. It only ever cared about one thing, filtering plankton. Mouth open, gills wide, day in, day out. You watch it disappear into the blue, just a faint silhouette now. Unsolved, unbothered, unforgettable, even if no one really knows what it is. You're ankle-deep in museum storage now, surrounded by shelves that look like they were built during the Napoleonic Wars and haven't been dusted since. The air smells like old paper and regret. Each shelf creaks under the weight of bones, some in labeled drawers, others just sitting there, anonymous, waiting for someone to care again. You found the right place. This is where Leedsichthys lives now, not in glory, but in fragments. Here's what you're looking at. One of the most misunderstood, mismeasured creatures in the entire fossil record. Leedsichthys problematicus, the fish that refuses to give a straight answer. The bones are real, but what they mean, that's another story. Let's talk about the lies bones tell. Imagine this. You find a single curved piece of bone. Looks like part of a rib. You take some measurements, compare it to similar ribs from other fish, and then you multiply your way into madness. That's how early paleontologists tried to estimate the size of Leedsichthys. Some of the first reconstructions pegged it at around 10 meters long. That already made it huge, bigger than most modern fish. But then someone found a larger bone. And another. And they just kept scaling up. One report boldly suggested it could reach 30 meters. That's blue whale territory. And not the kind of close kind. The full-sized, this thing might be the biggest vertebrate ever kind. And here's the kicker. Nobody agreed on which bones they were measuring. One paleontologist would take a gill arch fragment and assume it was from an adult. Another would take a similar piece, assume it was from a juvenile, and suddenly the adult estimate doubled. Multiply enough of those educated guesses together, and you've got a 40-ton problem. Historians still argue whether the largest size estimates were wildly off or surprisingly close. Some even think we've underestimated Leedsichthys because we're only ever finding the middle parts. The ends, which would help with scaling, are often missing or so fragile they disintegrate during excavation. And it's not just the size. It's the shape. Here's where it gets real fuzzy. When you don't have a full skeleton, you have to fill in the gaps. Think of it like finding 3 tiles and trying to draw the rest of the mosaic. A gill arch tells you something. A fin ray tells you something else. But neither tells you the body proportions, tail shape, or head length. So early reconstructions? All over the place. Some show Leedsichthys as a bloated sardine, shaped like a rugby ball with fins. Others go long and sleek, almost torpedo-like, resembling a fishy bullet train. One particularly enthusiastic illustration made it look like a cross between a whale shark and a zeppelin. No one really knew what they were doing, but everyone was pretty sure it was big. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. By the early 20th century, Leedsichthys had been declared the largest bony fish of all time. Not because we had proof, but because no one could find anything bigger with bones. Cartilaginous giants like the megalodon or modern whale sharks. Sure, they're up there, but they don't count the same way. Leedsichthys had the mass, the bone structure, and just enough fossil evidence to wear the crown, whether it fit or not. Now here's a fun twist. Because the bones were so warped and broken, many of them ended up misidentified entirely. Some pieces thought to be pectoral fins turned out to be parts of the gill basket. Others labeled as vertebrae weren't vertebrae at all, just random bits of rib or skull base. There are entire drawers of Leedsichthys fossils. The question mark says everything. And still, the reconstructions kept coming. You're walking through one now, an old museum display, long since taken down. The bones are mounted on wire frames, hanging like laundry. Gaps are filled with plaster. Guesswork fills the spaces between guesswork. If you look close, you'll notice that the skull is almost entirely fake. Most of the fins are casts from other fish. The jaw? A composite of fragments from at least 3 different specimens, possibly from different growth stages, possibly even different species. And still, the sign reads, Leedsichthys problematicus, 16 meters long, estimated. You love the confidence. One of your required oddities. In the 1980s, a researcher tried to model Leedsichthys' growth rate using a mix of fin ray growth rings and modern fish data. The conclusion? This fish might have taken over 30 years to reach full size. That would make it one of the slowest growing large vertebrates ever. Like the redwood tree of the sea. But then someone else came along and said, well, maybe the rings don't indicate years at all. And the whole theory collapsed. The problem here is that bones change shape as animals grow. Juvenile Leedsichthys bones look wildly different from adult ones. That's normal in fish. But when all you have are scattered bones from different stages of life, it becomes a nightmare. There are debates over whether some known fossils are actually Leedsichthys at all, or just other pachycormid fish that died trying to be big. Historians still argue whether our existing reconstructions represent a single animal or a Frankenstein blend of multiple ones. Think about that for a second. The largest fish in the fossil record may be a composite of unrelated individuals, all stuck together with plaster and optimism. Now imagine being the poor grad student assigned to reanalyze the holotype specimen, the original fossil that gave Leedsichthys its name. You open the box. You expect clarity. Instead, you find confusion layered in dust. Some bones aren't labeled. Others are chipped beyond recognition. The paper records don't match the actual material. You're piecing together a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the box lid shows a completely different picture. And that brings us to a subtle but important point. We might never get a full Leedsichthys skeleton. The places where they died, shallow seas with soft sediment, aren't great for preserving whole fish. Even when a body sank intact, scavengers and time tore it apart. Most fossil finds are like archaeological crime scenes, signs of violence, disturbance, and quiet erosion. Still, they keep digging. Somewhere in Germany, there's a quarry that's turned up more Leedsichthys bones. France has some fragments. A few even surfaced in South America. But none of them are complete. And they never match each other perfectly. Either the species was more variable than we thought, or we're still lumping together several different animals under one unhelpful name. You walk through another storage room. It's darker here. No public exhibits. Just trays of mystery. Each one labeled with care, each one full of uncertainty. You pick up a bone, gently, like it might disintegrate. It's thick, curved, flared at the end. Maybe a fin base. Maybe not. You put it back and exhale. Leedsichthys doesn't offer easy answers. But maybe that's the point. Not everything from the past wants to be solved. Some things are meant to linger, unanswered, until someone asks the right question in the right way. And until then, this fish remains what it's always been, misunderstood, oversized, and more rumor than reality. A jigsaw puzzle scattered across continents. A ghost in the sediment. A record-breaking giant that keeps lying about how big it really was. You step back, watching the pieces of plaster and fossil swim in your imagination. You can almost see it, maybe 10 meters, maybe 20, probably not 30. But big, slow, silent. A prehistoric legend built on broken math. Still floating, still filtering, still problematic. You're in the field now. Not the metaphorical field, the actual one. Muddy boots, brittle shale, wind that smells like damp limestone. And somewhere beneath your feet, maybe a rib, maybe a gill arch, maybe just another broken fragment of Leedsichthys that'll go into storage with a question mark on its label. This is the reality of paleontology. Most of it is squatting in the cold, poking at rocks, and trying to convince yourself that the thing you just uncovered is more exciting than it looks. Here's the issue: Leedsichthys never gives you the whole picture. You never get a full skeleton. Not even close. What you get is a fossil jigsaw puzzle where 80% of the pieces are missing and half of the remaining ones might be from a completely different puzzle. It's a mess. A beautiful, scientifically maddening mess. Let's break down why that is. The bones of Leedsichthys were big, some of the largest ever discovered for any bony fish. But they were also fragile. Think sponge cake on the ocean floor. Pachycormids like Leedsichthys didn't have the dense, rock-like bones you see in land animals. They had lightweight, porous bones, great for floating in the sea, terrible for fossilizing. And when they died, they didn't go quietly. They'd sink, maybe flip upside down, get scavenged by smaller animals, pulled apart by currents, buried unevenly. A rib here, a jaw there, a gill arch snapped in half and buried at a slant. After a few million years of pressure, chemical change, and tectonic shift, what's left is a scene of chaos. Fossil disarray, literally. This is your quirky fact for tonight. In one dig site, researchers found parts of 3 separate Leedsichthys individuals jumbled together. None complete, none articulated, all lying at slightly different angles. It took weeks just to figure out which bones belonged to which fish. One paleontologist described it as trying to reconstruct 3 plane crashes using only the wing fragments. And the worst part? This isn't rare. Across Europe, most Leedsichthys finds follow the same pattern: scattered, broken, incomplete. There's a well-known site near Peterborough in England where the holotype specimen was unearthed in the 1800s. That find included dozens of bones, but none of them connected. Just a pile. You try to lay them out, and it's like a blind man drawing a whale from memory, using chalk on a moving train. Historians still argue whether the Peterborough remains come from one fish or several. The bones vary in size, shape, and apparent age. Some look mature. Others are clearly juvenile. The sediment layers aren't clear-cut either, so dating becomes a guessing game. Was it one massive carcass torn apart by currents? Or a prehistoric buffet line of dead Leedsichthys drifting into the same shallow basin over time? No one knows. But the uncertainty itself has become a kind of legacy. You walk into another museum archive. This one's older, tiles cracked, catalog cards yellowed. On one wall, there's a faded map of fossil sites. England, France, Germany, Chile, Morocco. Leedsichthys pieces found in all those places. But try mapping them together into a single body plan, and it's like connecting constellations across hemispheres. Here's the thing. Most of what we know about Leedsichthys comes from scattered bones. A gill basket here, a section of skull there, maybe a partial pectoral fin if you're lucky. Vertebrae? Almost non-existent. That's a problem. Vertebrae are usually the backbone of any reconstruction, pun intended. Without them, you're guessing torso length based on the angle of ribs or the size of fin rays. It gets even more frustrating, because every time a new specimen is found, it forces researchers to reconsider all the old ones. A bone that used to be definitely from the pectoral fin now looks suspiciously like a skull base, because the new find has a nearly identical piece in a completely different position. So what happens? You go back to the museum drawers. You pull out the old bones. You relabel. You reguess. You feel the floor shift under your certainty. And in some cases, you realize something worse, that some of the bones were misidentified for over a century. That's right. There are Leedsichthys bones in museum storage that were originally labeled as marine reptile remains. A few even ended up in plesiosaur collections. It wasn't until the late 20th century that someone looked closer and said, wait a second, this isn't even remotely reptilian. Your mainstream historical fact. The original Leedsichthys bones were first described by Alfred Nicholson Leeds in the late 1800s. He wasn't a formally trained paleontologist, just a farmer with a knack for digging up Jurassic bones from his land in Northamptonshire. Over his lifetime, he unearthed thousands of fossils, many of them marine, and many from a little-known formation now called the Oxford Clay. Alfred Leeds was meticulous. He catalogued, drew, and recorded everything. But even he struggled with Leedsichthys. The bones were just too weird, too warped. He described the fish, gave it a name, Problematicus says it all, and sent the specimens to museums hoping someone smarter would figure it out. They didn't. Not really. They just inherited the problem. And that's where things still stand. Each new find raises as many questions as it answers. There's no Rosetta Stone specimen. No complete skeleton hidden in a cliff. Just scattered fossils. Partial pieces. A frustrating, beautiful, scientifically tragic puzzle. Let's take a minute to imagine what it would feel like to dig one of these bones out yourself. You're kneeling on a slope in the German countryside. The rock is damp, crumbling under your fingers. A hint of curved bone peeks out. You scrape gently, breath held. It's about the length of your forearm, faintly ridged, maybe a fin base. You don't know yet. Could be part of Leedsichthys. Could be something else. Could be nothing. You take notes. You photograph. You carefully lift it free. And then you wait. Months, maybe years, for the rest of the matrix to be prepared. For the labs to scan it. For the experts to argue over what it is and what it isn't. All that work, all that care, and in the end, it might just be another Leedsichthys with a question mark. But maybe that's okay. Because there's something quietly beautiful in the mystery. In knowing that we don't have it all figured out. That nature still has secrets, and the past isn't done messing with us. You picture the fish now. Not the skeleton, the real one. Swimming in the Jurassic Sea. Slower. Filtering plankton. Avoiding predators. Living its life with zero awareness that 160 million years later, people in gloves and glasses would be losing sleep over its rib fragments. The irony is almost poetic. A fish that probably moved with complete ease through its ancient oceans now causes absolute chaos for modern science. But you're fine with it. You're starting to enjoy the ambiguity. Leedsichthys might never be fully understood. But every broken bone, every misidentified fragment, every awkward museum label adds to the story. It's not clean. It's not linear. But it's real. You pack up your tools, dust off your hands, and look out over the field. Somewhere out there, under layers of mud and time, another piece of the puzzle waits. Or maybe just another dead end. Either way, it's all part of the journey. You walk into the museum, and the air smells like dust, floor wax, and unrealized potential. Somewhere in here is Leedsichthys, the massive, misunderstood fish you've been chasing through muddy fields and broken rock for 6 sections straight. You expect a centerpiece, a towering mount, maybe dramatic lighting. Instead, you get an approximation. There it is. Leedsichthys problematicus. At least, that's what the placard says. The actual display? A Frankenstein assembly of bones and sculpted filler, pinned together with steel rods and cautious optimism. It looks impressive at first. Really. The thing stretches across a whole room, long as a bus and as confusing as a tax form. But then you lean in, and the illusion starts to crumble. Some of the bones are real. Some are casts. Some are just guesses. Painted fiberglass, shaped by inference and, probably this is where it went, logic. You realize the creature in front of you isn't a fossil. It's an educated daydream, frozen in time. That's the thing about museum reconstructions, especially of something like Leedsichthys. They're less about certainty and more about presentation. You don't have the full skeleton. No one does. So curators work with what they've got. Bone fragments, analogous species, mathematical models, and let's be honest, a little bit of artistic flair. Let's take the Natural History Museum in London. They've displayed Leedsichthys on and off since the early 20th century, usually tucked behind the showier dinosaurs. One version used to feature a 9-meter partial replica suspended from the ceiling, most of it not bone at all, just resin sculpted from comparative anatomy. And the funny part? Even that was a compromise. Early estimates from the 1880s suggested Leedsichthys could grow up to 30 meters long. Later estimates scaled that down, then up, then down again. Today, the safe guess is around 16 meters for an adult, though some researchers still claim it could have reached 20, maybe even 27. And museum mounts have reflected that confusion. So, here's your mainstream historical fact. In 2003, a team led by Jeff Liston reanalyzed many of the known Leedsichthys specimens and argued that previous size estimates were flawed, either inflated by bone misidentification or shrunk by overly conservative math. Their work tried to re-establish a more consistent model, suggesting that while Leedsichthys was enormous, it probably wasn't a record breaker. But again, nobody agrees on this. And you can feel that tension in every museum that tries to display it. You step closer to the gill basket section. It's one of the few parts that's unmistakably Leedsichthys. Gigantic, fan-like arches splayed out like the ribs of an old umbrella. These were used for filter feeding, straining plankton from seawater by the gallon. But even here, what's real and what's recon? The metal clamps and painted resin blur the line. You start playing a mental game. Cast, real, totally fake, possible rib. What even is that? It's not just London. The Peterborough Museum houses one of the largest Leedsichthys bone collections in the world, all from the Oxford clay formation. But instead of a dramatic full mount, they've opted for a more honest approach. Drawers, diagrams, labeled fragments. You can spend hours going drawer to drawer, seeing just how chaotic the fossil record really is. One drawer contains what looks like a slice of baguette, long, pale, porous. Turns out it's a section of pectoral fin ray. Another holds a vaguely spoon-shaped bone that once confused researchers into thinking it was a pelvic structure. Nope. Gill arch. Fin. Welcome to paleontology, where bones play dress-up and your confidence is a fragile thing. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one museum mount in Germany, part of the reconstructed jaw of Leedsichthys was made from a modified cow bone. No joke. A temporary placeholder, installed during a reconstruction rush in the 1960s, and accidentally left in the final display for over a decade. Visitors thought it was part of the fish. Staff knew. No one said anything. But bureaucracy. And maybe embarrassment. You see, museums are under constant pressure to present the final form of prehistoric creatures, especially big ones. You can't exactly sell tickets for, come see the scattered rib fragments of a mysterious fish. So, they fudge a little. They use digital scans, artistic models, and educated guesses to fill the gaps. It's not deception, it's interpretation. But it raises a question. What are we actually looking at when we view a mounted fossil? Truth? Theory? Theater? Historians still argue whether reconstructions like these help or hinder scientific understanding. On the one hand, they bring extinct creatures to life. They give the public something to marvel at, something tangible. On the other hand, they risk cementing speculative anatomy in the minds of visitors. Someone walks out thinking, that's what Leedsichthys looked like, when really, it's just what we think it might have looked like, on a good day with good funding and a generous helping of model clay. You wander into a darker gallery now. This one's quiet. Just a few small displays. One of them is a 3D printed model of a Leedsichthys skull, based on fragments from multiple specimens. The texture's weird, almost rubbery, but it gives you a sense of scale. That mouth could have inhaled you whole. Slowly, awkwardly, with the grace of a semi-truck sucking in a bag of jelly beans. It hits you then, Leedsichthys probably wasn't elegant. It was big, slow, uncoordinated. It didn't chase prey. It drifted, filtered, maybe bumped into things. It was a whale before whales, a giant with no roar, no teeth, no bite. Just volume and persistence. And that's probably why it's so often overlooked. There's no drama in it. No killing claw. No bone-crunching jaw. Just a giant fish that slurped plankton and left behind confusing bones. But the reconstructions? They try to make up for that. They add flair. A slight curve to the body. A dramatic eye. A raised fin. Little touches to make the fish seem more dynamic than it probably was. Because let's be honest, massive, slow-moving blob with questionable anatomy doesn't sell museum tickets. So we sculpt the narrative just like we sculpt the fossils. And yet, there's something admirable in the effort. Even when they're wrong, even when they're half cow bone, half plaster, these reconstructions keep Leedsichthys alive. They give it a presence, a shape, a reason to be remembered. You take one last look at the mount. The light hits it just right, casting shadows along its side. For a moment, it really does look alive. Floating, drifting through its Jurassic Sea, unaware that its bones would one day be argued over by scientists, mounted in fiberglass, misrepresented, misunderstood, and quietly marveled at by tired museumgoers like you. You smile, because even in its most incorrect form, Leedsichthys has done something rare. It made you stop. It made you wonder. You're still in that museum, but mentally, you've drifted. Somewhere between the resin bones and the awkward lighting, a realization sinks in. No one's ever really sure about Leedsichthys. They say it's a fish, a filter feeder, the largest bony fish of all time. But when you look closely, everything about it carries this faint, buzzing shrug. And that's the vibe that's haunted paleontology for over a century. A giant fossil that refuses to fit neatly into anything. You exit the gallery and slip into a quieter space, not physically, but in your mind. You're entering the mental archives now, the stretch of scientific history where Leedsichthys just lingers. Not as a breakthrough, not as a headline, but as an open folder no one wants to close. This is where we hit the stalemate. Let's rewind. After its discovery in the 1880s, there was some excitement. A few papers here and there. Some ideas tossed around. But nothing definitive. Then came the silence. Leedsichthys didn't vanish, but it stopped being anyone's priority. For decades, it existed in this academic limbo, too incomplete to explain, too famous to forget. That's the paradox. Leedsichthys is huge, absurdly so, but its bones are fragile. Many of the remains found are disarticulated, warped, or fragmented beyond immediate recognition. That means every new fossil find is less a revelation and more a riddle. You don't get a eureka moment. You get that might be a fin ray, or a rib, or someone's misfiled dinosaur vertebra. And the debates? Oh, they just keep looping. Mainstream historical fact. In the early 20th century, paleontologist Arthur Smith Woodward, an actual big deal in British fossil circles, tried to pin down Leedsichthys once and for all. He examined material from the Oxford clay and confidently declared, yes, this is a filter-feeding pachycormid. That's the family Leedsichthys supposedly belongs to. Think tuna-like fish, fast swimmers, some with weird jaw mechanics. But even back then, Woodward knew the data was sketchy. Fast forward to modern times, and you've got researchers like Jeff Liston trying to clean up the mess. In the 2000s, he led several efforts to reassess the available fossils, measuring bone growth patterns, reclassifying misidentified parts, and trying to standardize size estimates. You can almost hear the sigh in his voice when you read those papers. We're still guessing, but here's our best shot. And here's your fringe tidbit. At one point, some researchers wondered if multiple species had been lumped under Leedsichthys by mistake. That maybe, just maybe, what we were calling a single massive fish was actually a chimera of several similar-looking species, smushed together in the fossil record like a prehistoric buffet. That theory never fully caught fire, but the fact that it was even considered tells you something about the confidence level here. Historians still argue whether Leedsichthys even deserves its own spotlight, or if it's just a messy data point in the broader story of Jurassic seas. When you can't show a full skeleton, when you can't demonstrate anatomy with certainty, what is the story? A fish existed. It was big. We don't have most of it. The end? But not quite. Because sometimes, scientific value doesn't come from what we know, but from what we keep not knowing. That's what keeps Leedsichthys around, not in the public imagination. Let's face it, it's never beating a T-Rex, but in the research trenches. Every once in a while, a paleontologist picks up a weird bone in a clay pit and goes, "Wait, is this Leedsichthys?" And the cycle restarts. Part of the issue is context. The Oxford Clay Formation, where many of the bones come from, isn't the easiest place to work. It's layered, distorted by time, and filled with overlapping remains of everything from ichthyosaurs to ammonites. Sometimes bones wash together from different carcasses. Other times, parts of the same skeleton are scattered across meters of muck. You end up piecing together a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are chewed, bent, or just plain missing. And here's the kicker. Leedsichthys bones, especially the cartilage-heavy ones like gill arches, are easily damaged. They don't preserve well. You're more likely to find them in warped fragments than in crisp, photogenic slabs. So even when someone thinks they've got a good specimen, they still spend months or years proving it. This is the scientific shrug in action. You have professionals spending a decade cataloging 20 bones, because each one might change the narrative or confirm nothing at all. Let's talk about academic publishing for a second. If you want a solid paper, you need a strong claim. But Leedsichthys doesn't lend itself to strong claims. So papers often take the form of, "Here's this bone. We think it's a gill arch, possibly Leedsichthys." Probably. Here's 40 pages explaining why we can't be 100% sure. Exciting, right? And yet, these careful, cautious works matter. They're the slow grind of science. Not the dramatic, "we've discovered a new dinosaur" kind of story, but the patient, weary, sip your coffee kind of story. I measured every striation on this vertebra with a laser scanner and found nothing new, but now we know that for sure kind of story. This is the realm where Leedsichthys lives now. What you start to notice is how this fish attracts a particular kind of paleontologist. The patient ones. The ones willing to comb through basements of forgotten fossil drawers, label microscopic grooves, and spend 3 weeks debating whether that ridge is a growth plate or just weathering. These aren't the Indiana Jones types. They're the quiet obsessives. The ones who don't need closure to stay curious. And they're the reason Leedsichthys hasn't been abandoned completely. Because despite the decades-long shrug, the fossil trail never fully goes cold. Someone always picks it back up. A new technique, CT scanning, 3D reconstruction, comparative modeling, breathes new life into old fragments. Suddenly, a fin ray thought to be 2 meters long gets downgraded, or upgraded, or recategorized as a different part entirely. You walk through that mental hallway now, past display cases that don't exist, filled with data sheets instead of bones. It's all conjecture, but that's the point. Leedsichthys is the fossil equivalent of trying to reconstruct a novel from 3 sentences and a burnt corner of the cover. But even the scraps matter. You feel that now. Because here's the quiet beauty. In a field driven by spectacle and certainty, Leedsichthys is a reminder that ambiguity has its own value. It keeps minds active. It forces better questions. It cultivates doubt, and that's not a flaw, that's a feature. Sure, the public may yawn. The museum may move on. But somewhere, in a quiet lab, under fluorescent lights, someone is still brushing clay off a mystery bone, and whispering the same thing they've whispered for 100 years. This might be Leedsichthys. And that whisper is enough. You're back in the water, but this time it's deeper, colder, and filled with shadows you can't quite place. You're imagining the Jurassic Sea where Leedsichthys lived, a vast underwater world, mostly calm but occasionally roiled by storms, waves, and the endless drift of plankton. The thing about prehistoric oceans is they were crowded places. Not just with giant fish, but with an entire menagerie of life. Marine reptiles like plesiosaurs and pliosaurs lurked in the depths. Ammonites spun their delicate shells in the currents. Sharks, though smaller than today's giants, were still efficient hunters. And then there was Leedsichthys, gliding through this teeming world. A gentle giant with no teeth and no rush. You're probably picturing something graceful, a whale shark of the Jurassic, slow and majestic. But here's the catch. Leedsichthys was probably a little clunky. Bulkier than your typical streamlined fish. It wasn't built for speed or quick turns. More like a floating skyscraper, a slow-moving filtration system that simply churned through the water. Mainstream historical fact. Leedsichthys is often called the largest bony fish ever, with estimates around 16 meters, roughly 52 feet, and some even suggest it might have been longer. But remember, all of this comes with a heavy side of probably and maybe. Its lifestyle was similarly fuzzy. The consensus is that Leedsichthys was a filter feeder, scooping up plankton and small creatures through its specialized gill rakers. But how exactly it fed, how it moved, and how it interacted with other marine life remain open questions. You're floating there now, watching the shadows of other Jurassic creatures pass by. The subtle undulations of Leedsichthys' body create gentle currents that ripple through the water, disturbing nothing. It's a world far removed from the frantic life we know today. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some scientists have suggested that Leedsichthys might have had a head covered in a thick, leathery skin or even a sort of baleen similar to whales. Not hard teeth but soft filtering structures. This is based on indirect evidence and analogy with modern filter feeders, but the fossil record offers no direct proof. It's a speculative yet fascinating idea. Historians still argue whether the fish's feeding mechanism was more passive, like simply filtering water as it swam, or active, involving deliberate suction or even some form of filter cleaning behavior. The nuances of this debate affect how we picture Leedsichthys moving and behaving. Now, imagine its environment. The late Jurassic seas were warm and shallow in many areas, perfect for plankton blooms. These blooms provided the buffet Leedsichthys relied on. But it also meant competition. Other large filter feeders existed, including early marine reptiles and smaller fish, and maybe even some giant filter-feeding sharks. In that context, Leedsichthys' size may have been its best defense and feeding strategy. Bulk allowed it to cruise steadily through dense patches of plankton, efficiently filtering food without wasting energy. It didn't need to be fast because it wasn't chasing prey. That's why its anatomy is so important. Those huge gill arches you've heard about acted like strainers, filtering water to catch tiny organisms. They were delicate and specialized, structures that are incredibly rare to find fossilized intact. This rarity feeds back into the taxonomic headaches you've been hearing about. Without complete gill arches or jaws, scientists struggle to pin down how exactly Leedsichthys' feeding system worked and whether it was similar to modern whale sharks or filter-feeding rays. And then there's movement. Leedsichthys probably had a powerful tail but a relatively rigid body. It might have relied on steady, rhythmic tail beats rather than agile maneuvers. This is consistent with a filter-feeding lifestyle but also means it was vulnerable to faster predators. That brings you to predator-prey dynamics. Leedsichthys coexisted with enormous marine reptiles, some of the largest carnivores of their time. While it was a giant, it was also potentially prey for these beasts. Its size was a deterrent, but it likely had to stay vigilant. Here's a quirky aside. Some fossils from the Oxford clay show healed bite marks on large fish bones, possibly from marine reptiles. Whether these belong to Leedsichthys or its relatives remains uncertain, but it paints a picture of a dangerous neighborhood where even giants got nibbled on. Historians still debate whether Leedsichthys formed schools, like some modern large filter feeders do, or whether it was a solitary swimmer. Schooling would have helped protect against predators and increase feeding efficiency, but there's no fossil evidence to confirm this. As you imagine the sea now, the murky depths become alive with the slow movements of Leedsichthys and its contemporaries. It's a world where size was survival, where filter feeding was an evolutionary niche just beginning to be explored, and where mysteries still swim beneath the surface. You let your mind drift, caught between scientific facts, fringe ideas, and the endless unknown. The giant fish lumbers on, silently, a living question mark in the deep. You're back on dry land, but the mental fog hasn't lifted. The more you try to pin Leedsichthys down, the more it slips through your fingers. That's because the real story isn't just about one fish, it's about a whole family, the Pachycormidae. Think of it as a messy branch on the fish family tree, with Leedsichthys as the awkwardly enormous cousin nobody can quite place at the family reunion. You see, Pachycormids are a group of extinct bony fish that lived from the Jurassic through the Cretaceous, and they came in a variety of shapes and sizes. Some small and sleek, some larger and toothy, others slow and filter-feeding like Leedsichthys. This diversity adds to the confusion. When you find a bone, you have to figure out, is this from Leedsichthys or one of its many weird relatives? Mainstream historical fact. Pachycormids were among the earliest vertebrates to evolve filter feeding, long before whales or whale sharks appeared. Leedsichthys represents the extreme of this trend, growing to massive sizes to take advantage of abundant plankton. But here's where things get tricky. The taxonomy, the classification system, of these fish is a tangled mess. Over the last century, different species have been assigned and reassigned, sometimes based on tiny differences in bone shape that might just be individual variation or even fossil distortion. For example, the species Leedsichthys problematicus itself might be a catch-all name for multiple closely related species. Some specimens labeled as Leedsichthys have features that don't quite fit, suggesting either a new species or even a different genus. And that's your fringe tidbit. In 2016, some paleontologists proposed splitting Leedsichthys into several species based on subtle differences in gill arch morphology and fin ray structure. This sparked debate. Some argued for more precise classification, while others warned that the fragmentary fossils don't provide enough evidence to justify splitting. Historians still argue whether Leedsichthys problematicus is truly a single species or a convenient umbrella term. The truth is buried in the fragments, much like the fish itself. This taxonomic headache complicates everything. Size estimates, growth patterns, ecological role, they all depend on which bones belong to which species. If you lump everything together, you risk overestimating size and diversity. If you split too finely, you risk creating phantom species based on incomplete data. And the naming history is a mess too. The original Leedsichthys fossils were discovered by Alfred Nicholson Leeds, hence the genus name, but other large pachycormid fossils have been shuffled in and out of this genus over the years. Names have been changed, resurrected, or abandoned based on fragmentary evidence. To make matters worse, pachycormids left behind few complete skeletons. The ones we do have come mostly from the Middle to Late Jurassic, especially the Oxford Clay Formation in England and similar deposits across Europe. This incomplete fossil record means that every new find can rewrite the family tree. A single new fin ray or jaw fragment might shift relationships dramatically. It's like building a puzzle with half the pieces and none of the picture on the box. You might be wondering, why all the fuss about classification? Because how we organize these fossils shapes our understanding of evolutionary history. If pachycormids are more diverse than we thought, it suggests a complex evolutionary experiment with filter feeding in fish, repeated multiple times in different forms. And if Leedsichthys itself turns out to be multiple species, it tells a story of ecological niche partitioning, different species specializing in different ways of filtering plankton, coexisting in the same Jurassic seas. Here's a quirky insight. Some pachycormids had teeth, unlike Leedsichthys. These carnivorous relatives might have hunted smaller fish or invertebrates, showing that this family wasn't just about gentle filter feeders but included predators too. This mix of feeding strategies suggests a dynamic evolutionary landscape. Historians still argue whether pachycormids should be split into separate families or treated as a single, diverse group. Some even propose new clades based on recent fossil discoveries, but the debates continue. Taxonomy might seem like a dry academic subject, but it's crucial for understanding the broader picture. Without a clear family tree, the ecological and evolutionary role of Leedsichthys remains hazy. You take a step back and realize this is the real, problematic part of Leedsichthys' story. Not just the broken bones or inflated size estimates, but the messy, ever-changing family relationships. And that's okay. Science isn't about perfect answers. It's about refining questions. The debates, the arguments, the reclassifications, they all push knowledge forward. So you lean in again, examining the bones, the labels, the papers. Every fragment is a clue. Every disagreement an invitation to dig deeper. Leedsichthys and its pachycormid relatives are a testament to the complexity of life, both past and present. A reminder that nature doesn't fit neatly into boxes, no matter how hard we try. And that's a good place to pause, breathing in the chaos and mystery. You're holding a bone now, mentally, anyway, and it's not much to look at. Just a hunk of fossilized collagen and mineral, maybe a vertebra or a chunk of gill arch. But it carries weight. Literally, it's heavy, but also symbolic. It's part of the long, slow, quiet unraveling of Leedsichthys. And now you're about to wade into one of the thorniest questions of all. How did something so big grow? Growth patterns. That's the headache currently knocking around in the heads of paleontologists who study this thing. Because for Leedsichthys, there's no easy answer. Some fish grow steadily their whole lives. Others have explosive spurts followed by long plateaus. But Leedsichthys? Its growth trajectory looks like someone drew it while sleepwalking. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Bones of different sizes show Leedsichthys at various stages of life, from juvenile to full-grown behemoth. Some reconstructions suggest individuals started small, like any fish, but then experienced years, maybe decades, of steady growth. What's strange is how variable that growth might have been. Two specimens of similar age, based on bone histology, could differ in size by several meters. So, was this a fish that just kept growing and growing? Or did it hit a ceiling? Historians still argue whether Leedsichthys reached its full size through rapid early growth or a slower, drawn-out process. This matters because it shapes everything from its metabolic rate to how long it lived. Rapid growth implies a high-energy lifestyle, maybe even endothermic tendencies. That's warm-bloodedness, if you want to impress someone at a dinner party. But slow growth fits better with a cold-blooded, energy-efficient ocean drifter. Here's a quirky bit for you. One study suggested Leedsichthys might have lived for 30 years or more, based on growth rings in the bones, kind of like trees. But here's the catch. Those growth rings can be misleading. In fish, they're not always annual. They might reflect food scarcity, temperature changes, or random biological weirdness. So counting rings doesn't guarantee accurate aging. Let's zoom in on the bones again. Leedsichthys' skeleton wasn't built to last. Not for us, anyway. Its cartilaginous skull and poorly ossified vertebrae were perfect for a buoyant, gentle lifestyle, but a nightmare for fossilization. The parts that do fossilize, like the gill arches and fin rays, don't grow the same way as solid bone. That makes it hard to piece together its ontogeny, fancy word for its growth story. Even worse, some of the biggest Leedsichthys bones found are warped or incomplete. And as we've mentioned, size estimates often rely on scaling models from modern fish, mostly ones like sturgeon or paddlefish. But how reliable is that really? Leedsichthys wasn't just a scaled-up sturgeon. It was its own thing. Historians still argue whether the scaling models used to estimate size and growth are even valid. Critics say that assuming Leedsichthys grew like a paddlefish is like guessing a giraffe's height using a goat. Same basic blueprint, sure. But evolution has a habit of getting weird with the details. Now here's a fun mental image. Imagine a juvenile Leedsichthys, maybe the size of a dolphin, navigating plankton-rich waters, dodging predators. It's got the same gill arch setup, just scaled down. As it grows, its demands for plankton increase massively. Was the ocean productive enough to sustain that kind of feeding machine? Likely yes, but it probably had to keep moving, constantly hoovering up invisible clouds of food. That leads to one of the big open questions. Was Leedsichthys a continuous feeder, eating all day every day? Or did it feed in bursts, gorging itself and resting? Its anatomy leans toward the first idea, but we can't rule out the second. Let's also not forget about reproduction. Nobody's found Leedsichthys eggs or hatchlings, not a surprise, but still. Was it a broadcast spawner, like many modern fish, releasing clouds of eggs and sperm into the sea and hoping for the best? Or did it have more controlled, selective mating behavior? Fringe theory time. Some paleontologists have speculated that Leedsichthys might have used shallow coastal waters as nursery grounds, similar to modern sharks and rays. These safer environments would have helped juvenile fish grow without being instantly devoured by something with a lot more teeth. But without fossilized juveniles, it's just an educated guess. And here's your third historical debate of the night. Scientists can't agree on whether Leedsichthys was more like modern teleosts, bony fish, or retained more primitive, chondrostean traits like sturgeon. The distinction affects how we model its metabolism, behavior, and growth strategy. Again, most of what we know is inferred, extrapolated, or argued over with increasing levels of caffeine. You're probably sensing a pattern. The more closely you look at Leedsichthys, the blurrier it becomes. It's big, but how big? It grew, but how fast? It fed, but how much? There are charts and graphs, sure, but they're all working with guesstimates and educated comparisons. And the takeaway here? Leedsichthys didn't just stretch the boundaries of fish size, it stretched the boundaries of how we think about prehistoric growth. It forces paleontologists to confront the limits of the fossil record, to work with scraps and still try to tell a story. So here you are, swimming through time again, drifting beside a creature that might have taken 20 years to grow into its full glory. Or 30. Or maybe it never stopped. The Jurassic Ocean is quiet now. You can picture it, a wall of soft-bodied giants, mouths open, gill arches fluttering like wind chimes in the current. Nothing hurried, nothing urgent, just slow growth, slow movement, slow lives, until they ended. And with that, another piece of the puzzle floats gently into place. Not final, not certain, but just enough to keep you coming back. You're still out there, drifting in the fossil fog, trying to pin down a fish that never meant to be remembered. Leedsichthys problematicus wasn't built for legacy, it was built for efficiency. For gliding through plankton clouds and growing slowly into the kind of creature that makes scientists question their rulers. And now, it's time to talk about where exactly this thing lived and what kind of world it called home. Not in the abstract. Not just the Jurassic. Let's get specific. Let's drop you into the middle to late Jurassic seascape of Europe. England, France, Germany. Back then, a shallow, tropical sea, warm, murky, full of life and decay. You're floating above the Oxford Clay Formation now. Not glamorous, but rich with secrets. Silt and clay washing in from river deltas. Low oxygen, perfect for preserving the bones of fish that didn't quite make it. Mainstream fact time. The Oxford Clay is one of the most fossiliferous marine formations from the Jurassic period. It's where most Leedsichthys remains have been found. You'd also spot ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and ammonites swirling below you. A busy neighborhood, especially if you're something slow and edible. Here's the thing, Leedsichthys wasn't alone. It lived in an ecosystem that teemed with predators. You've got marine reptiles with mouths full of needle teeth. You've got crocodile-like thalattosuchians sliding between currents. And don't forget about the cephalopods, tentacled nightmares with a taste for anything soft-bodied. And yet, Leedsichthys thrived. Probably because nothing wanted to waste energy chewing through meters of bony gill arches and muscle just for a mouthful of plankton filter. It wasn't armored, but it didn't need to be. Size was protection. Same principle as with whale sharks today. If you're that big, you're just not worth the trouble. Now, here's a quirky detail. Some sedimentologists think the water Leedsichthys swam through was often hypoxic, low in oxygen, especially near the seabed. That would push most fish toward the upper layers of water, where oxygen was more plentiful. Leedsichthys, being a filter feeder, may have stayed in that photic zone anyway, skimming the sunlight edge for its microscopic meals. Historians still argue whether Leedsichthys was truly a pelagic drifter, open ocean style, or more of a coastal cruiser. The fossil sites suggest nearshore environments, but that could just be where it died, not where it lived. After all, fossilization doesn't happen out in the deep blue. You have to sink somewhere muddy and still to get preserved. So maybe it died in the shallows. Maybe it lived there too. Maybe it wandered in to spawn and got caught in a sediment trap. Another open question: how seasonal was its environment? If plankton blooms came in pulses, like they do in modern oceans, Leedsichthys would have had to move. Not fast, not frantically, but with purpose. Following invisible tides of food. You're floating alongside one now, maybe 14 meters long. Gill arches open wide. Eyes small but alert. It's not dumb, but it's not hunting either. It's focused. This is a machine built to convert microscopic protein into massive bulk. Now look around. There's competition. Other filter feeders. Smaller ones. Maybe different species of pachycormid fish with narrower diets. Some of those might have overlapped with Leedsichthys, one eating surface plankton, another diving a bit deeper. Ecological niche partitioning, if you want the formal term. But here's a more poetic take. Imagine a forest of fish, each tuned to a different frequency in the ocean's rhythm. Leedsichthys hums low and slow, while the others flit and flicker around it. And predators? They're circling. Maybe a Liopleurodon moves in the distance. Massive jaw. Fast swimmer. But it doesn't dive in. Not yet. Leedsichthys is still too big. Still too alive. But eventually, one of them dies. Maybe from age. Maybe from a bloom of low oxygen. Maybe it just gets too tired to swim. And when it sinks into soft sediment, and the body begins to vanish. Only a few bones survive. The ones dense enough. The ones lucky enough. Fast forward to the 1800s, and a farmer pulls a strange shape out of the clay. No context, no idea what it was. That's the legacy of this seascape, fragments. Teasers. The fish version of a badly redacted government document. Fringe theory incoming. Some researchers have suggested that Leedsichthys may have migrated seasonally, north to south, maybe following plankton blooms, maybe even crossing what's now northern Europe. But without strong evidence, it remains a hypothesis floating in academic limbo. Still, the idea of migration makes sense. Big animals follow big resources. And the Jurassic Ocean, though unfamiliar, had some of the same patterns we see today: upwelling zones, nutrient-rich coastlines, seasonal blooms. The same cues that draw whales across oceans might have guided this ancient fish hundreds of millions of years ago. And if you're asking, could Leedsichthys go extinct just from ecosystem shifts? The answer is yes. All it takes is a drop in plankton productivity, or a change in sea level, or a new predator that figures out how to exploit the big, slow target. But that didn't happen right away. Leedsichthys lasted for millions of years, through at least a few different Jurassic stages. It was a success story in slow motion. That's important. Most animals in the fossil record? Blips. Leedsichthys was a presence. You don't stick around that long without knowing how to work your niche. So, as you float back through time, through those murky prehistoric waters, you realize something else. This fish wasn't a freak. It was the logical endpoint of an evolutionary strategy. Grow big, eat small, move slow, live long. And when it finally vanished, the oceans didn't collapse. Other fish filled the niche. Eventually, different kinds of filter feeders evolved: baleen whales, manta rays, whale sharks. But none quite like Leedsichthys. None with that particular balance of bulk and silence. It lived in a world we can barely imagine and left behind only traces. A few bones, a few puzzles, and just enough mystery to keep us dreaming. You're standing ankle-deep in mud again. Not literal mud, though given everything you've trudged through so far, it might as well be, but the intellectual kind. The mud of assumption, of missing data, of weirdly specific academic arguments that never quite get resolved. Because now we're in the deep end, interpretation. Leedsichthys doesn't just confuse us in physical form, it stumps us philosophically. This section? It's about how scientists have tried to reconstruct the life Leedsichthys might have lived. What it ate, how it moved, how it grew, and how the heck something that size even functioned in a Jurassic Sea. Let's start simple. Diet. Leedsichthys was a filter feeder. That much seems clear. thanks to those elaborate gill arches that look like they were designed by someone halfway between an engineer and a screen door salesman. These arches likely held gill rakers, fine, comb-like structures perfect for trapping plankton from water as it passed through the mouth and out the gills. Mainstream fact: filter feeding is one of the most efficient strategies in the animal kingdom, and multiple lineages have evolved it independently. Leedsichthys in the Jurassic, whale sharks and baleen whales in our modern oceans. That's convergent evolution at work. Same problem, same solution. But then comes the twist. How effective were those rakers, really? We haven't found them. Not directly. Just scars on bones that suggest where they might have attached. So a lot of reconstructions are guesswork, modeled loosely on modern analogs like paddlefish and basking sharks. Problem is, those are modern analogs, not Jurassic fish with a totally different physiology. Historians still argue whether Leedsichthys fed more like a whale shark, slow, wide-mouthed cruising, or more like a paddlefish, rhythmically pulsing through clouds of zooplankton with short bursts. The jury's still out. We may never know. It depends on soft tissue we'll probably never find. And movement? That's another shot in the dark. We don't have a full skeleton. We're lucky if we get a few ribs, some gill arch fragments, and a piece of fin. But based on the dimensions we do have, Leedsichthys probably wasn't fast. Think, wide turns, steady cruising speed, not built for sudden dashes. Which brings us to a strange question: was Leedsichthys graceful? Fringe theory alert. Some paleoartists and biomechanists have speculated that the fish may have moved with a kind of lumbering elegance, using its massive tail for slow propulsion while the rest of its body followed like a drifting curtain. Think a parade float in a lazy river. Graceful, yes, but only in a very specific, very large way. Growth is another mystery wrapped in a handful of inconsistent bone histology slides. Leedsichthys likely grew continuously, like many modern fish, but its exact growth rate? Unknown. Some estimates suggest it may have taken decades, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years, to reach its full size. One team examined growth rings in the bones, sort of like tree rings, but for vertebrates, and tried to back-calculate an annual growth curve. The result? Somewhere between surprisingly slow and, yep, that's a fish that lived a while. Here's a fun quirk. Juvenile Leedsichthys may have looked nothing like their adult forms. It's possible that they spent years in relative anonymity, smaller, sleeker, even mistaken for other species, before beginning their enormous, food-driven metamorphosis. Historians still argue whether the known fossils actually represent a single life stage or a mix of juveniles, subadults, and fully mature individuals. The lack of a complete growth series means we're often comparing apples to whale-sized oranges. So, to recap the working theory, Leedsichthys was born small, drifted in open waters, ate constantly, grew steadily, and, if it survived predators, parasites, environmental shifts, and sheer biological bad luck, became a floating freight train of plankton conversion. But what was it like to be Leedsichthys? That's the hardest question of all. You imagine it now. Warm water filtering through your open mouth, pressure changes sensed along a long lateral line, faint movements echoing through your body from dozens of meters away. You don't think in symbols or speech. You think in temperature gradients, in chemical cues, in plankton density. A constant rhythm of feed move feed rest. That's your loop. And every so often, something strange happens. A shadow overhead. A sudden spike in noise. You turn slightly. It's a marine reptile. It circles but doesn't strike. You're too big. You move on. The moment passes. The loop resumes. Your world is layers. Water density, plankton layers, light depth. You don't see the world like we do. You feel it. Eventually you grow tired. Not in the emotional sense. Not from boredom. Just worn down. Organs aging. Muscles slower to respond. The loop breaks. You sink, and somewhere millions of years later, a piece of your gill arch confuses the hell out of a graduate student. And that, maybe, is the best we can do. We can't resurrect this animal. We can't watch it in motion. We can't talk to it or track it or tag it. but we can build a rough outline of its life by stacking clues and assumptions on top of each other until they wobble into something that kind of resembles a life story. It's not perfect, but it's enough to make you stop and wonder, what else are we missing? What else swam these ancient seas, leaving behind just enough to torment the curious? You're elbow deep in a display case now, well, metaphorically. The lighting is harsh, the glass is smudged, and there's a plastic sign that says "Do not touch," which of course, you immediately ignore in your mind. Because here it is, Leedsichthys in a museum, or at least the museum version of it. And spoiler alert, it's more patchwork than precision. This section is about the reconstruction game. The attempts, the errors, the compromises. How scientists and curators have tried to make sense of the splinters and scraps that Leedsichthys left behind, and how those attempts have shaped what the public thinks this fish actually looked like. Let's start with the centerpiece, the Natural History Museum in London. Their display of Leedsichthys isn't a skeleton. It's a cast, and not even a complete one. Just the best guess version, of Frankenstein's monster of bones from multiple specimens, enlarged, molded, and stitched together to form something vaguely fish-shaped. Mainstream fact: the first major attempt to reconstruct Leedsichthys came in the early 20th century, when fossil preparators began piecing together the bones unearthed in England's Oxford clay. But many of those bones were fragmentary, flattened, or incomplete, making it a puzzle with half the pieces missing and no photo on the box. So what did they do? They filled in the gaps. Sometimes literally, with plaster or resin. Other times figuratively, by copying elements from modern fish or from better preserved ancient relatives. Here's the tricky bit. This wasn't deception. It was necessity. You can't hang a fish the length of a school bus from a ceiling using only the bits you found in a quarry. You have to extrapolate. Historians still argue whether the reconstructed Leedsichthys skeletons on display are anywhere near accurate. Some say yes, they're close enough to communicate scale and body plan. Others? They roll their eyes and say it's a glorified art project. And that's where the fun begins. You walk past one of these displays and what do you see? A massive mouth, ribs like ship beams, an arched back that sweeps down into a tapering tail. Maybe you think, whale? Maybe you think, monster? What you're really looking at is consensus art, a compromise between paleontology and spectacle. Quirky side note, one of the earliest reconstructions of Leedsichthys actually made it look like a sort of prehistoric sunfish, squashed and bizarre. Later versions leaned more shark-like, giving it a sleeker, more hydrodynamic shape. And then you had the super optimistic renderings in textbooks from the 1980s and 90s that showed it cruising serenely past plesiosaurs like some kind of oceanic godfather. None of them are wrong. None of them are completely right either. And then there's the color question. No one knows what color Leedsichthys was. But that hasn't stopped illustrators from slapping on anything from muted gray blues to vibrant striped patterns. You've got Leedsichthys in earth tones, in camouflage, even in wild, bioluminescent purples. Because hey, if you're guessing, might as well guess bold. There's also the movement problem. Static skeletons tell you nothing about how an animal looked in motion. Leedsichthys might have glided like a manta ray. It might have moved with a slow, undulating wave, like a giant sardine. Or it might have wobbled awkwardly, a victim of its own anatomical bulk. Fringe theory time. Some biomechanical reconstructions suggest that Leedsichthys was actually quite flexible, despite its size, because many of its bones weren't tightly interlocked. Instead, cartilage probably played a huge role in shaping its body, allowing for smoother, subtler movement. If true, that would mean most reconstructions make it look stiffer than it really was. But cartilage doesn't fossilize well. So we're left with only guesses. Another challenge? Scale. You don't just walk into a museum and drop a 16-meter fish on the floor. Most reconstructions are scaled down. The casts are trimmed. The more optimistic dimensions, like those 27-meter early estimates, have been quietly retired, replaced with the more conservative 16 to 18-meter range. But the myth lingers. People want Leedsichthys to be the biggest. They want it to tower over other marine reptiles. They want to stand under it and feel something primal and dwarfed. And so, reconstructions often stretch the truth, Not maliciously, but theatrically. You get a skeleton that's longer than any single specimen has ever measured, or a headpiece blown up by 20% just to match the vibe. Here's where that matters. The public learns from these displays. Kids come in and see this giant fish suspended mid-swim, and they internalize that shape, that size, that pose. And years later, when they read that Leedsichthys is actually just a jigsaw of jawbones and ribs, surprise. But you can't blame the curators. Fossil display is part science, part storytelling. And with something as incomplete as Leedsichthys, storytelling has to fill in a lot of blanks. Still, not everyone's happy about that. Some paleontologists push for more transparency, museum labels that say, bluntly, only 30% of this skeleton is based on actual fossil material. Others argue that doing that kills the magic. And there's a deeper point here, one that sticks with you as you stare at the behemoth behind the glass. How much of what we think we know about the past is just really good stagecraft? Because Leedsichthys, for all its magnitude, is a ghost. A ghost in plaster and resin. A fish whose bones have been swapped and reshaped and reimagined 100 different ways across 100 years of paleohypothesis. But that's not failure. That's how paleontology works. You don't start with certainty. You start with fragments and you argue. You build models and then tear them down. You change your mind. You let new bones rewrite old stories. And every time you get closer, but never quite close enough. That's why, if you look around the field, you'll find half a dozen different reconstructions of Leedsichthys, depending on the year, the artist, and the institution. No two are identical. Some are bulkier. Some are more streamlined. Some have eyes that look like they've seen things. Others look bored. And none of them are complete. Because the real Leedsichthys? It's still buried. Still waiting in the Oxford clay. Still hiding in a block of matrix someone labeled miscellaneous fish fragments in the corner of a museum drawer. So the next time you walk past a museum cast of this ancient giant, remember, you're not looking at the fish. You're looking at the argument. And now here you are, standing at the edge of it all. After all the confusion and guesswork, the fish dust and misnamed bones, the taxonomic rearranging and museum myth-making, after all of it, you're left with the final question. What did Leedsichthys mean? Not in a cosmic sense. In the practical, paleontological, sit down and take notes sense. Because Leedsichthys wasn't just a giant fish with a catchy name and a public relations problem. It was a turning point. A case study, a lesson. First off, it stretched our expectations. Before Leedsichthys, nobody thought a bony fish could get that big. Cartilaginous giants like sharks, sure. But bony ones? Not so much. Then this awkward fossil jigsaw of a creature swam onto the scene, and suddenly the limits had to be redrawn. Mainstream fact, Leedsichthys is still the largest known bony fish in the fossil record. Even if you take the conservative measurements, it dwarfs modern-day oceanic sunfish and other heavyweights. It proved that filter feeding wasn't just a modern trick. That long before baleen whales started scooping up krill, and long before whale sharks and manta rays hit the plankton buffet, the Jurassic oceans had already produced a monster with a similar game plan. It showed that being big wasn't just for predators. That there was evolutionary space, an ecological niche, for something massive and gentle and slow. A cruiser. A sieve on fins. Historians still argue whether Leedsichthys was a true keystone species in its ecosystem, one that shaped the environment around it by its mere presence. Some say yes, a massive filter feeder would have impacted plankton populations, nutrient cycling, and even predator behavior. Others aren't so sure. The fossil record just isn't complete enough to support a firm ecological role. But it's a worthy thought. Because if Leedsichthys was a keystone species, then its disappearance mattered. When it went extinct, sometime in the late Jurassic or early Cretaceous, depending on who you ask, it might have triggered ripple effects across its food web. Now here's your quirky detail. Despite its size and fame, Leedsichthys doesn't have its own blockbuster documentary. It's been featured in a few dino shows, sometimes mislabeled, sometimes with an extra row of teeth it probably never had. But it's never gotten the star treatment. Maybe it's too obscure, too clumsy looking, Maybe filter feeders just don't sell tickets like T-Rex does. Which is a shame, really, because Leedsichthys has something better than teeth. It has mystery. And here's the thing. The mystery hasn't ended. New fossils are still turning up. Every few years, someone cracks open a slab of marine rock and finds another fragment. Maybe a rib, maybe a gill arch, maybe a scale the size of your palm. And every time, it adds another brushstroke to the portrait. Sometimes the new pieces contradict the old ones. Sometimes they support them. And sometimes they raise even weirder questions like, was Leedsichthys truly global or mostly a European phenomenon? Did it migrate? Did it school in large numbers, like herring? Or was it more solitary? The answers? Still out there. But the bigger story, the one that sticks with you, isn't really about the fish. It's about the process. The digging. The piecing together. The guessing and re-guessing. Because Leedsichthys isn't just a fossil. It's a reminder that science is messy. That understanding the past isn't about uncovering perfect truths, but about refining imperfect ones. It's about changing your mind when new evidence comes in. About letting go of the cleaner version of the story in favor of the truer one. That's what makes Leedsichthys so problematic. Not because it's flawed, but because it's unfinished. It invites revision. It demands updates. It won't sit still. And there's something oddly comforting in that. You look at this awkward, hulking fish with its missing bones and its contested genus, and you realize it's still teaching us. Still swimming laps in the academic debate pool. Fossil sure, but also a challenge. One last thought before we let this beast go. Leedsichthys might be extinct, but its legacy isn't. Every big filter feeder alive today, whale shark, basking shark, blue whale, they're all echoing the same evolutionary experiment. Big body, tiny prey, endless water. Leedsichthys did it first, or at least early, and it did it with a jawbone like a snow shovel and gills big enough to ventilate a basement. So yeah, it deserves a little more love. Now, as you step back from the story, as the paleontological dust settles, and the museum lights dim behind your eyelids, there's nothing left to do but coast. Let the last thoughts drift like particles in the water, slowly sinking into quiet. And that leads us to, you're floating now. No bones, no debates, no display cases. Just the sound of deep water and the slow pulse of time. The ocean around you is dim and endless. No roar, no splash. Just a hush, a patient stillness. You're suspended somewhere in the Jurassic Sea, as if time forgot to carry you forward. Below you, something massive moves. It doesn't lunge or chase. It doesn't roar. It just exists, peacefully, purposefully. A slow arc through the plankton haze. You can't see all of it, but you don't need to. You feel the size in the space it takes up. You feel the age in the rhythm of its motion. Leedsichthys. It's not the most famous fossil. Not the prettiest. Not the most complete. But it's here, gliding past, unaware of your tiny drifting presence. Its gill arches flutter gently. Its massive mouth opens and closes like a doorway to the deep. And just like that, the questions fade. The arguments fall away. You stop wondering about sizes and species and reconstructions. You just watch. And for a few quiet seconds, that's enough. So take a deep breath. Let your thoughts go quiet. The fish swims on. And you, little by little, drift toward sleep, weightless, unbothered, and gently forgotten by time.